everyone, and welcome to Lab 4 in our series of demonstrations. And today we are going to talk about the effect of different kinds of exercises on blood pressure. So, here we have the presentation outline for you. As always, first we will talk that why you need to know about this particular topic. And very briefly, as you can see in point number 2, I'll talk about the mechanisms which operate in our body once somebody is exercising. And the points from number 3 to number 6 are the objectives for this practical. And that is why they are highlighted in red. And you should be aware exactly that what are the differences in cardiovascular responses between isotonic and isometric exercise. And point 4, it's more specific that we want to discuss systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure in a lot more detail out of the other serious responses between various exercise intensities. And once we are done with the normal, then we will discuss that what are the abnormal or the pathological blood pressure responses and what are the red flag or the danger signs which hint or indicate you that you should stop or cessate exercise. And at the end, we will discuss something about the data sheet which you're going to do in your lab once you are in here later during the day. Great, so we are all set and let's make a start. What is the purpose and reason about learning for this particular topic? You want to think then as an undergrad kinesiology student, why should I know about different cardiovascular changes while somebody is exercising? You can take a minute, pause this video and try to think and come up with an answer, and I will let you know the answer in just a moment. So, if you're thinking on these lines, then you are doing really great. That once we do exercise, our demand of oxygen of our body increases. And as we all know, oxygen is delivered via blood. So we need more blood to the exercising muscles. And that can only happen when the cardiovascular regulatory mechanisms alter themselves to meet this increasing demand of oxygen, and the blood pressure, both the systolic and the diastolic, it varies itself, alters itself to meet the increasing oxygen demand while somebody is exercising. And what are these changes in all these cardiovascular parameters? We'll see in a bit. Great. So in this slide, as I've talked at the beginning, we will very briefly summarize actually the mechanisms which alter when somebody exercises. And you can see that there is a role of local mechanisms as well as systemic mechanisms. Local mechanism means that they are confined to the exercising muscles. The responses which we see are there in that particular muscle or area where the person is exercising. And number 2 is the overall systemic sympathetic response, and that is conducted by the neural pathways or the nerves. So if we see the local responses, once we do exercise, we consume oxygen and we liberate a lot of carbon dioxide, lactic acid, potassium, and hydrogen ion. And all these ions are potential vasodilators. So there is mass vasodilation taking place, and a lot more blood is delivered, a lot more oxygen is delivered, and the increased need of the exercising muscle is met. This mechanism is helped by the neural sympathetic mechanisms, which increases the heart rate, the cardiac output, as well as it brings more and more blood or milk more blood from all the parts of the body to the heart to increase the cardiac output. So both these mechanisms, as you can see in the next point, are not operating separately from one another. They operate together and in an integrated fashion to bring about two changes. The first one is the regional redistribution, which means that blood from the organs which are not utilizing blood during exercise, for example, our GIT, once we are not eating food, we don't need blood in the abdomen or in the stomach or in the intestine. So blood is directed from these organs to the exercising muscles, maybe from the skin, maybe from the non-exercising areas of the body, and then there are systemic circulatory changes, which again we'll discuss in the next slide. So if we want to summarize this whole slide, there are local mechanisms and there are systemic mechanisms which operate in an integrated fashion to bring about cardiovascular changes. Now, let's concentrate on the cardiovascular changes, the differences of these changes between the isotonic exercise and isometric exercise. And before I jump into discussing these changes, I want to clarify the difference between these two exercise types. If you see the isotonic one, the name is self-explanatory. Iso means same, tonic means the strength or the length. So technically, the length of the muscle remain gonna change and strength is gonna constant, and it's the constant weight which is applied. So all kind of exercises, whether we will jog or we'll run, where the length of the muscle constantly changes, that is an example of isotonic exercise. In case of isometric exercise, again the name is self-explanatory. Iso means same, metric means length, which means that the length of the muscle remains constant. So it's the tension or the strength of the muscle which changes, but the length remains constant. For example, if we are pushing against a wall, the tension is going to increase, but the length of the muscle remains constant. So this is a good example of isometric exercise. So let's see what are the changes taking place. If we look at the heart rate, it is always going to increase. Whether it's an isotonic exercise or it's an isometric exercise, heart rate is going to come up because there is withdrawal of parasympathetic tone and there is increased sympathetic tone. Systolic blood pressure also increases, but there is a difference in the intensity of its increase. For example, in isometric exercise, you can see it's written there is a moderate increase. In case of isotonic exercise, there is a really sharp increase. And the reason for this difference is that once we are doing isometric exercise, then our vessels are compressed between the muscles continuously because of the continuous tension. So blood which is stagnant there cannot go back to the heart, cannot increase the cardiac output, cannot increase the systolic blood pressure that much. The rise which we see here is because of the blood which moves from the other parts which are not occluded by the continuous tension of the exercise. In isotonic, we don't have any problem. There is continuous contraction, relaxation, and once the muscle is relaxed, blood from everywhere in the body goes back to the heart, increases the venous return, the cardiac output, and the systolic blood pressure. The response in the diastolic blood pressure is really strange. And that's why I first want to discuss about the isotonic exercise. Whenever we are doing isotonic, there is a steep rise in diastolic blood pressure because of the sympathetic discharge. In case of the isometric exercise, it is different. So we are going to discuss whether it increases, remains constant, or decreases. We will see in our next slide. I just want to summarize these changes that if you are talking about isotonic exercise, you should remember that whether it's the heart rate, systolic or diastolic, everything is going to increase. In isometric, you can have varied kind of response. Now, as I've told you earlier, out of these responses, I'm going to concentrate on the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure more, especially during isotonic exercise, because this is the exercise which we are going to perform in our lab. Now, specifically constraining our discussion on systolic blood pressure, whenever somebody is at rest and starts to exercise, initially there is a steep rise in the blood pressure. And once the blood pressure is apt to supply a sufficient amount of oxygen via blood, it attains a plateau phase or it levels off once a steady state is attained. Typically, once somebody is exercising just a little bit less than its maximal capacity, then the blood pressure is somewhere between 140 to 160. So if you put somebody on a treadmill and you can observe a systolic blood pressure 140 to 160, it means you are doing good and the person is exercising well and you are getting a really good response. Now, once somebody is doing a graded dynamic exercise, the systolic blood pressure increases progressively as per the grade, and sometimes when somebody is exercising to its maximal capacity, the blood pressure can be as high as 250. But be aware, because we are near that hypertensive crisis range at times, so be aware of this range, and we'll discuss this more in the red flag sign. But you can sometimes see that high blood pressure at times. Now, if we look at the diastolic blood pressure, this is important to understand. Whenever somebody is doing mild exercise, then the blood pressure usually increases. What I means by the mild exercise is that we are classifying exercise based on intensity, depending upon the WHO classification of exercise based on heart rate, MET, etc. So typically, if the heart rate is around 100, it means the person is doing mild exercise. So there is activation of sympathetic system everywhere. So the diastolic blood pressure increases because the peripheral resistance increases. Now, when somebody is doing moderate exercise, means that if the heart rate is somewhere between 110 and 120 beats per minute, in that case, there are two things which are simultaneously going on in the body. In the exercising muscles, if you remembered the local mechanisms, because of the production of carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion, potassium ion, their lactic acid, there is vasodilation. Vasodilation means there is decrease in peripheral resistance, there is decrease in diastolic blood pressure. But that change is taking place only in the exercising muscles. Rest everywhere in the body, there is vasoconstriction, there is increased peripheral resistance, there is increased diastolic blood pressure, which means that this increase in the diastolic blood pressure all over the body is neutralized by the decrease in diastolic blood pressure in the exercising muscles, and as a result, there is a balance which is taking place, and that balance makes no change in the diastolic blood pressure and it remains pretty constant. If we look at very heavy intensity exercise, when the heart rate crosses, let's say 140, 150 beats per minute, in that case, lot of heat is produced in the body. And once there is a lot of heat in the body tries to dissipate heat. And heat is dissipated via sweat, and everywhere in the body there is vasodilation, so that more and more sweat is produced, heat can be dissipated, and when everywhere vasodilation is taking place, peripheral resistance declines, and that is why diastolic blood pressure decreases. If you are not able to completely decipher these mechanisms, just make a very clear rule. If it's a mild exercise, there is a decrease in blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure. If it's a moderate exercise, there is not much change in the diastolic blood pressure. And if it's a heavy exercise, diastolic blood pressure may decline because of excessive vasodilation. This is just what I have explained so far. It's just a diagrammatic representation or a pictorial representation. You can see Initially, the systolic blood pressure rises, and once somebody reaches a sub-maximal kind of an exercise, it attains a plateau phase, or it just lays off from here. Diastolic blood pressure can show various kind of responses. Initially, there is an increase. Once somebody is doing moderate exercise, you can see there is moderate intensity. So it's not much change you can appreciate. And you can see a slight downwards trend once somebody exercising heavy because of vasodilation, which I've just explained in the previous slide. So this is just a reiteration of what we have talked so far, that if large muscle groups are involved in exercise, let's say the glutes or the hamstring muscles, sometimes because of a lot of heat production, lot of metabolite production, there is vasodilation, and once vasodilation takes place, there is decline in the total peripheral resistance, which decreases the diastolic blood pressure. Now, this whole story which we have been talking about in the last 10 to 12 minutes is about isotonic exercise, when there is a contraction and relaxation taking place in an alternate fashion. Now let's concentrate on the isometric exercise. If you just go back and think what we have talked so far, isometric means that the length of the muscle remains constant throughout the exercise. The vessels gets compressed, the tension continue to build, the metabolites are trapped, and this is typically happens when you try to push against a wall, hold a hand grip dynamometer, or you are holding a bucket like this and the pressure increases continuously. So if you see, or if somebody is doing an isometric exercise, as I've been talking again and again, you can see it's written in the red that there is compression of blood vessels within the contracting muscles, which reduces blood flow. So because the blood vessels are trapped continuously throughout the exercise between the muscles, that blood from those vessels cannot go back to the heart, which means that the venous return decreases, which technically means that the cardiac output decreases. And once the cardiac output is decreased, we know that stroke volume is one of the components of cardiac output. So there is a slight increase, which is due to the blood returning from the other parts, but not from the exercising muscles. So you won't see a big response in cardiac output as we have been seeing in the isotonic exercise before. However, if you concentrate on the second point, there is a greater marked or big increase in the total peripheral vascular resistance, or the TPR. The reason is that the compression is continuous, so the occlusion is continuous, so there is a huge rise in TPR and there is a huge rise in diastolic blood pressure as a result. Now, this I have talked before, I am again repeating it, that heart rate increases at the beginning of exercise and continue to rise throughout the exercise period, because the parasympathetic tone is withdrawn once we start exercising, and once the parasympathetic tone is withdrawn, heart rate is gonna rise and is responsible for most of the increase in cardiac output. This point you want to join with the previous point, because I told you that stroke volume is not going to increase much because we cannot get blood back from the exercising muscles because of contraction. So it is solely the heart rate which is responsible for that increase in cardiac output. And summarizing this whole story, cardiac output increases, but not as much as in isotonic, and total peripheral resistance increases markedly, increasing the diastolic blood pressure to a really high level. Okay, in this graph, it just shows you this zigzag pattern with the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure when somebody is doing a leg extension exercise. So technically it means that when somebody is pushing, contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation, so there is a zigzag response for both the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure. Now, I always feel that You have been told in by all the trainers that you want to have a cool down after the exercise, especially as it's written after intense exercise. So I just want to discuss very briefly what is the rationale for a cool down after intense exercise. So the problem is that once we stop doing intense exercise, then the oxygen demand decreases, so the systolic blood pressure drops rapidly. This will result into the pooling of blood, especially the venous blood, in the heart, or the venous return decreases. So there is a drop in venous return and there is a drop in cardiac output. So a drop in cardiac output means that the total amount of blood pumped by the heart decreases. So sometimes the blood is not supplied optimum to the head region, and you can feel a bit of a lightheadedness or a blackout kind of a condition, or feeling of pass out, which we have discussed in our last practical, a kind of a orthostatic hypotension kind of symptoms. But this is not because of the problem in the blood pressure mechanisms. It's just because it takes time for the body to get back to the normal blood pressure mechanisms after exercise. So cooling will allow these mechanisms to redistribute the blood normally throughout the body to prevent fainting. Now, we are done with the normal blood pressure responses. Let's concentrate on the pathological blood pressure responses. If you see that the systolic blood pressure is not increasing if somebody exercising, it means that there is some problem. You should try to monitor the condition or stop the exercise. Similarly, if there is a severe increase or a severe decrease, especially decrease in the diastolic blood pressure, again think of some kind of problem going on and try to stop the exercise. Similarly, if the person is in a state of syncope or lightheadedness, stop the exercise. Or if you see the person is getting pale, or if this person is turning white, it means that he can land into some kind of shock. So try to stop the exercise. So if you see any of these abnormal systolic diastolic blood pressure responses or feigning or pallor kind of symptoms, think of stopping the exercise or refer to the person's physician before restarting the exercise. Now, this is a huge exhaustive list. I don't want to go over all the points. It's given in your textbook. You can always read it. Just want to highlight some of the important points which I have already discussed before, but it's just a recapitulation of the points which I have taught. If you feel angina kind of symptoms, means that if the person feels that there is a pain in the chest as he continues doing intense exercise, but that pain subsides when he stops exercising, can be due to angina, especially if the pain is radiating towards the back or towards the left shoulder. If there is a drop of more than 10 mmHg in the systolic blood pressure, think of stopping the exercise. Any decrease in the blood pressure, especially the systolic during exercise, is a real red flag sign. I've talked about the lightheadedness, confusion, pallor, all these symptoms. If you feel, just try to think of stopping the exercise. Also, if the subject requests, if he's feeling too much exhausted, if he feels he can't do it anymore, or there is a failure of equipment, these are some of the things which you try to monitor once somebody is exercising, and be alert, taking a quick decision. You just don't want to continue with the person exercising and landing into more and more trouble. You can always go through these points and we can talk about them in the practical. Now, at the end, I would like to talk about the lab activity 4.2. So you have to fill your basic details as usual. And in this one, you have to write your name, your gender, age, height, weight, the resting blood pressure, and the resting heart rate, and then use the formula to calculate the age predicted heart rate, and then take 85% of age predicted heart rate max. So once you calculate all this stuff, now you are good to move to the bicycle ergometer to do the exercise and record the responses. So typically we do a total of 12 minutes of exercise with the from minute 0 to minute 3 you have a workload of 0.5, and there is a dial on the bicycle ergometer which tells you how much you should keep the intensity of the exercise, and then record the heart rate, the blood pressure, and the RPE. Now, it's a good idea to do it in a group of 4 or 5 so that one person can be a subject who's doing the exercise, one person can record the heart rate by using the pulse, the radial pulse to be specific, the other person can record the blood pressure on one arm, and one person can hold the RPE or rating of perceived exertion card, asking the person how much exhausted he feels while doing the exercise. So for stage 1, you have to do it for 3 minutes. For stage 2, from minute 3 to minute 6, increase the intensity to 0.5 and continue doing it up till 1.5 for the next 3 minutes. And then for the cool down period, just go back to 0.5, which is like the warm up period from 0 to 3. So the person will do a total of 12 minutes of exercise with 3 minutes as the warm up, 3 minutes as the cool down, first 3 minutes and the last 3 minutes 0.5 intensity, and in the middle the exercise period is 1 and it will be graded to 1.5 in the middle 6 minutes. So the idea is that you can do it and exchange subjects for 2 people, but if the time is less and if you have time constraint, if you do it for 1 person, I'm absolutely okay with it, and we can discuss more about it during our lab. So that's the end of the presentation, but before ending, I want to recapitulate what we have discussed so far. We have talked about the purpose and reason for learning about this particular topic, that is why we want to learn about the changes during exercise. Then we have specifically discussed about the cardiovascular regulatory mechanisms which operate during exercise, and in that we talked about the local as well as the systemic mechanisms. Then we discussed the differences in the cardiovascular responses to isotonic and isometric exercises, and discussed in detail how systolic and diastolic blood pressure changes during exercise. We have talked about some of the abnormal blood pressure responses during exercise and discussed some of the cautions and red flag signs while exercising, which hints you to stop the exercise as soon as possible. And in the last 1 or 2 minutes, I've talked about the data sheet which you need to fill in the practical. I hope that this video is useful for you, and if you listen to it, you'll get something once we meet and demonstrate and do the practical in the lab. Thank you very much.